Hey up everyone. Motorcycles are in a constant state of evolution. Today, I'll be looking at some of the innovations that transformed the world of motorcycling and made motorcycles what they are today. Now, before you get disappointed with my list, I know there are bound to be some things I've left out. These are just the 11 innovations that I think are the most important. I know you may think differently, and that's fine. Feel free to share your opinions in the comments section below. Some things that have been reinforced while I was doing the research for this video is that the answer isn't always what you think, and the internet isn't always right. Bear that in mind, and if I have got anything wrong, which isn't unheard of, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching and for all the support for the channel. I honestly can't believe how fast it's grown. By the way, these aren't in any particular order. First, the first motorcycle with an aluminium perimeter frame. Now, this illustrates my point above straight away. The bulk of the internet credits Antonio Cobas, an ex-Grand Prix racer, with being the originator of the modern aluminium frame chassis. However, Nico Backer had also been making frames for himself, Will Hartog, Phil Reed, Johnny Soccotto, Agostini and many others since the 1970s. He was also moving away from steel construction at the time, and his first twin-beam chassis was used at almost the same time. It was in 1982 that Cobas developed a stronger and lighter aluminium twin-beam chassis to replace the steel backbone frames he had been using, and Backer released his the same year. But the dates do seem a little contradictory when it comes to who actually got there first. When it comes to production bikes, there are even more questions. The 1983 RG250 Gamma had an aluminium cradle chassis, which was the first major move to the use of aluminium, but in my opinion it was the 1987 Yamaha FZR 750 and 1000 Genesis that were the first production motorcycles to use a true aluminium twin-spar chassis. Let me know if you know something I've missed. Next, we have the first motorcycle with telescopic front forks and water cooling. Now, contrary to popular opinion, Google and even Wikipedia, the Suzuki GT750 was definitely not the first water-cooled motorcycle. In 1908, Alfred Angus Scott released the Scott Squirrel. It had water cooling, telescopic forks, a lightweight duplex frame, and a low centre of gravity. Its road holding was pronounced as superb at the time, but the forks had no damping, so you can imagine what the competition must have handled like. The sad thing is that Scott didn't persevere with telescopic forks. Later models of his motorcycles returned to using girder forks. In 1934, the Danish vacuum cleaner company Fisker and Nielsen, makers of the Nilfisk vacuum flask, decided they would build a motorcycle. They called it the Nimbus. It had an oil-damped telescopic fork up front, and this was the first time such an item had appeared on a motorcycle. BMW saw the design and immediately copied it. Then, in 1935, they released the BMW R12 and R17 to rave reviews and much more fanfare than Nilfisk had had for the Nimbus. Across the internet, as I said, it states very clearly that the Suzuki GT750 Water Buffalo, first built in 1971, was the first motorcycle with water cooling. And as I've said already, it wasn't. Alfred Scott designed and produced a motorcycle in 1908 that used a 450 two-stroke twin-cylinder water-cooled engine. That's a full 63 years before the GT750. Other innovative features of the Scott included a patented 2-speed chain transmission and possibly the first kickstart too. However, even Scott weren't the first. After all my research, I discovered that 76 years before the GT750, the first water-cooled motorcycle was actually the 1899 Holden, which was a water-cooled flat-4 1100cc motorcycle that was effectively the Goldwing of its day. There are even some complete examples still working. Now that brings us on nicely to the first multi-cylinder motorcycles. Now this one doesn't have one answer really, as I have considered different engine configurations, so we have several firsts. Technically, the world's first twin-cylinder production motorcycle was the 1894 Hildebrand and Wolfmuller, which used a straight twin engine. The cylinders were laid flat and faced forwards, with the pistons connecting directly to the rear wheel using a locomotive-style connecting rod. So it wasn't a particularly practical bike. The first vertical twin came along in 1903. The Werner Motorcyclette became the second production motorcycle model to use a straight twin engine, and this had vertical cylinders. The Werner engine was 500cc and used cast iron cylinders with integral heads and side valves. Scott, as we know, followed shortly after in 1908. However, it was in 1938 that the Triumph Speed Twin was released. This was the motorcycle that led to straight twin engines becoming more widely used by other brands. The engine was designed by Edward Turner of Valpage and was initially used in the 1933 Triumph 6 sidecar hauler, which won the International 6 Days Trial silver medal in the 1933 Moores Trophy. During the development of the engine, it was found that a 360-degree crank was better suited to the use of a single carburettor than the original 180-degree crank, so it was changed. The earliest V-twin engine motorcycle I can find was produced in November 1902 by the Princeps Autocar Company in the United Kingdom. The following year, V-twin motorcycles were produced by the Eclipse Motor and Cycle Company in the UK, Glenn Curtis in the United States, and NSU Motorwerken in Germany. The first Eclipse machine was exhibited at the Stanley Show in 1903. It had a variable speed gear, engine-driven rear wheel, and freewheel clutches. In 1904, a wide-angle V-twin was added to the range. The engine fitted into a loop frame with braced forks and conventional belt drive, but there's little more information. Peugeot, which had used Panhard-built Daimler V-twins in its first cars, began producing its own V-twin engines in 1904. This Peugeot engine powered the Norton motorcycle that won the very first Isle of Man TT race in 1907. The first flat twin and first V4 were actually British. Joseph F. Barter's Light Motors Limited was one of Douglas Motorcycles' customers. Barter developed the Fay bicycle engine system in 1904. The Fay's 200cc flat twin engine was mounted in line with the frame. Barter founded Light Motors Limited to build the Fay system, and production began in 1905. The Fay's name was anglicised to Fairy shortly afterwards, and in 1916 the Motorcycle magazine states clearly that the 1904 Fay was the earliest flat twin motorcycle engine. Douglas made castings for Light Motors and took over the manufacturing rights when Light Motors went out of business in 1907. From 1907, a 350cc Douglas version went on sale. It was similar to the Fairy, with the engine in line and mounted high in the frame, but it had a chain-driven camshaft underneath. At the 1907 Stanley Show, Douglas attracted lots of attention with a V4 engine motorcycle. This had automatic inlet valves, 2-speed drive, but unfortunately the V4 never made it to production, and by the 1908 show it was only the updated inline twin that was on show, now lighter and with a newer lower engine position. The FN4 was the world's first production inline-4 motorcycle, manufactured in Liège by Fabrique Nationale from 1905 until 1923. It was also the world's fastest production motorcycle from 1911 until 1912. The motorcycle was developed in 1904, tested later that year, and had its first public debut in 1905 at Paris Motorcycle Show. It was a commercial success on release, with production increasing over its 20-year run. I will give a quick mention to an obscure air-cooled inline-4 developed in 1903 by Charles Binks in Nottingham, England, but never produced commercially. There's almost no information about this motorcycle other than it did actually exist. Both of these were actually preceded by a Boxer 4, manufactured in 1897 by Henry Capel Loft Holden. This would become the first four-cylinder gasoline-powered motorcycle and was manufactured in Britain between 1899 and 1902. The Holden was a water-cooled flat-four 1100cc motorcycle, and a few examples still exist, notably in the London Science Museum. The prototype of the American Henderson 4 was built in 1911 and production started in 1912. It sparked the imagination of the international media as Charles Stearns Clancy set out to be the first motorcyclist to circle the globe on his Henderson. A special mention here goes to Gilera 2. Although not the first, this motorcycle marked a major development of the engine technology that had been being improved since the early 1900s. In 1935, a water-cooled, supercharged, double-overhead camshaft four-cylinder engine, developed by Italian firm Rondine, was fitted across the frame of a Gilera race bike. It revved to 8,500 RPM and produced over 60 horsepower, which was huge compared to almost any other engines of the day. It propelled the little Gilera to 155 miles an hour. In 1937, the Gilera took the world motorcycle speed record at 170 miles an hour, and after World War II, it lapped the Isle of Man TT course at 101 miles an hour without its supercharger. Then, in 1968, Honda launched the CB750. This was the first four-cylinder road bike of the modern era. It had great road manners and was sold at the same price as the British Twins of the day. This motorcycle is often described as the first superbike, and the format lives on to this day. The 1973 Kawasaki Z1 rammed home the potential of the inline four as an engine format for performance motorcycles, and it continues to be the popular choice for high-performance motorcycles. Next, we have the first motorcycle to use monoshock rear suspension. In 1972, Yamaha introduced monoshock single shock absorber rear suspension on their motocross race bikes. The suspension was designed by Lucien Tilkens and became so successful that the other Japanese manufacturers quickly developed their own single shock absorber designs. Honda called theirs the ProLink, Kawasaki built the Unitrack system, and Suzuki launched the full floater system. The first single shock appeared on a production bike in Yamaha's 1974 YZ250 and 360. The monoshock was tucked right up under the fuel tank and was mounted to a rigid triangulated cantilever swinging arm. Next comes the first electric lights and starter. In 1914, Indian launched the world's first motorcycle with electric lights and starter. The Indian Chief was at the top of their range, and the introduction of electric lights was a major jump from the use of acetylene and oil lamps. It also had an electric starter as an optional extra, but the system was poorly designed and very unreliable. The real first came when Harley-Davidson had an electric start to the Cervicar in the early 60s, and then the Electric Glide was released in 1965, making it the first production motorcycle to be fitted with an electric start as standard. Then, in 1968, electric start became even more of a standard feature. The 1968 Honda CB750 heralded a new era of motorcycling. After that, many of the Honda street models were fitted with electric start, and other manufacturers were forced to adopt the technology which all riders loved. The earliest two-stroke engines were not very efficient, and manufacturers tried many ways to improve fuel flow and efficiency. Some of these included stepped and shaped pistons, but the results weren't great. It was the introduction of induction valves that led to a serious improvement in the efficiency and power delivery by two-stroke engines. First came disc valves. In East Germany at DKW's pre-war home, the small MZ race team, under the guidance of Walter Caden, had been patiently developing two-strokes with Zimmermann-type rotary inlet valves since 1953. Their best engine was at the forefront of engine design, producing over 200 brake horsepower per litre. The engine was a 124cc single and produced 25 brake horsepower at 10,800 rpm. It took rider Ernst Degner on to win the East German, West German and Italian Grand Prix that year. Degner did a deal with Suzuki, stole the plans to the engine, and soon after, most Japanese two-strokes were using it. Then came reed valves. By 1973, the 350cc class was very popular in the USA, which was a huge market for the developing Japanese motorcycle companies, and the RD350 was built to cash in on the popularity of the class. The air-cooled RD350 was a development of the YR5, which had an identical frame as well as sharing some running gear and engine parts. However, the new motor featured a different head and cylinders from the YR5. It had 7 transfer ports instead of 5, 28mm carbs, and an over-square 64x54mm bore and stroke. The new RD350 pumped out around 40 brake horsepower at 7,500 rpm, and its newly developed reed valve induction system gave it a more punchy and flexible power delivery than any other two-strokes of the day. This made it much more usable in everyday riding conditions, and it became the benchmark by which other motorcycles' performance was judged. By 1966, Kawasaki had gained a foothold in the lucrative American market with the W1, but 1969 marked Kawasaki's entrance as a major manufacturer with the launch of the 500cc 3-cylinder two-stroke H1 Mach 3. This was the fastest production motorcycle in its class and was the first multi-cylinder street motorcycle to introduce a capacitor discharge or electronic ignition system rather than the traditional contact breaker ignition system commonly called points. Moto Morini began using the CDIs in 73, Ducati and Moto Guzzi used them for the first time in 77. BMW first used it in the late 70s on the R100 model, and by the late 70s it was used by Kawasaki, Suzuki, Yamaha and Honda on pretty much all of their larger models, and many of the smaller ones too. Next, we have the first motorcycle to use the engine as a stressed member of the chassis. Now, stressed member engines as a concept were first patented in 1900 by John Carver Phelan and his nephew Harry Rayner. They were pioneered as early as 1916 by Harley-Davidson's 8-valve racer and incorporated in the keystone or diamond frame of the full production Harley-Davidson Model W, built in 1919. In 1946, the Vincent Series B Rapide was designed with an even more advanced chassis that included the use of the engine as a stressed member of the chassis too. The next step in development came during early testing of the 1983 Kawasaki GP-Z900R. Twin down tubes were originally used, creating a full cradle. However, the down tubes were found to carry a little load, so they were removed. The final design relied entirely on the combination of the steel backbone and the engine to give it improved chassis rigidity. The first use of disc brakes on a motorcycle was under the Douglas first. The 1923 Douglas RA dirt track race bike. The RA came from its unique braking system, which was developed and patented by the British Motorcycle and Cycle Car Research Association. It was not what we think of as a disc brake system today, though. Instead of having calipers with pistons inside that squeezed the disc to slow it down, a cable-actuated RA brake pressed onto the edge of the rotating disc. The front and rear discs did increase the stopping power of the Douglas race bike, but they were prone to grabbing. The experiment was scrapped, and by 1925 Douglas went back to fitting drum brakes to all of their bikes. Several racing teams developed disc braking systems for their bikes, but it would be another 40 years before disc brakes were fitted as standard to a mass-production motorcycle. It was actually MV Agusta that released the first road-going motorcycle to be fitted with disc brakes. In 1965, they used a disc brake system on their 600cc touring motorcycle. It used a mechanical brake linkage. However, it would be Honda's seminal CB750, which would be remembered as the first motorcycle to use hydraulic disc brakes as we know them today. These early mass-produced systems were often not actually very good, and certainly not as effective as a good drum brake system of the time, especially in the wet. But the technology improved quickly and spread across the ranges of most manufacturers' larger capacity bikes. The first overhead camshaft motorcycle engine was actually built in France. The Peugeot 500M was a French racing motorcycle designed by Ernst Henry in 1913. It was the first motorcycle ever designed with a double overhead camshaft. It used a multi-valve cylinder head too, with 4 valves per cylinder. Undoubtedly, though, the bulk of the development work for overhead camshaft engines was done during the 1920s in the UK. Although Norton often get the credit, it was actually the Velocette company who were ahead of many other British manufacturers of the time. Velocette were a small family-owned firm and were renowned for the quality of their products. They sold almost as many hand-built motorcycles during their life as the giant BSA and Norton companies mass-produced in their factories. Velocette realised that in order to grow as a company, they needed a new motorcycle, and they developed an overhead camshaft 350cc engine which became known as the K-Series. It was introduced in 1925, and after a year of teething troubles, Velocette entered the K models into the Isle of Man TT and Brooklands races. A 350cc overhead camshaft Velocette won the 1926 Junior Isle of Man TT, and this was a year before Norton won with their overhead camshaft engine in the senior event. The reliability and performance of the new engine gave Velocette a long string of victories. It led to the introduction of a production racing model called the KTT. The motorcycle was built for 21 years between 1928 and 1949. The 1929 KTT was also the first production motorcycle to feature a positive stop foot-actuated gear change. Honda developed a mechanical anti-dive system for the front forks of its race bikes in the 1970s. The Honda Torque Reactive Anti-Dive Control or TRAC system was seen on a number of Honda's race bikes and was eventually fitted to some of their production bikes in the mid-80s. These were the CB1100, the CB900 and even the VFR 750 of 1986. However, it was first seen on the 1985 CB700 SC, the Nighthawk S that was only released in the USA. The system worked by using a brake caliper that was hinged behind the fork leg on a pivot link. When you pull the brake lever, the caliper pivots slightly and presses against the valve inside the fork, which restricts the oil flow, making the suspension stiffen up and reduce the dive. Well, that's it for now. I'm sure you will add some more firsts you think were more important below. Do feel free to point out if I'm wrong too. I hope you enjoyed the video. I know there's probably going to be some disagreement, and I'd love to hear from you down below in the comments. Let me know what you think the most important innovations are in motorcycle technology and engineering. Thanks for all the support, and thanks for watching the videos. I can't believe how well the channel's done. Thanks for your views, likes and subscriptions. They are all much appreciated. Thanks for supporting me. Until the next video, ride free everyone.